He stole my idea, took all the credit, and then looked me dead in the eyes and fired me. And 5 years later, I walked back into that same office as his boss. If you've ever had someone take something from you, something you built, something you believed in, and just walk away with it like it was nothing, this story is going to hit different. Because this isn't just some feel-good revenge story. This is about what happens when you refuse to quit after the worst moment of your life. This is about a guy who lost everything in one afternoon. His job, his idea, his income, and somehow turned that into a $10 million comeback that nobody saw coming. And honestly, the way he did it will change how you think about failure. So if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where stories like this live, real, raw, and the kind that actually make you think. And drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps us bring more stories like this one to more people. Now let's get into it. His name was Daniel Mercer, and in 2017, he was 28 years old, working 14-hour days at a mid-sized tech company called Vortex Systems, based out of Austin, Texas. Daniel wasn't just another employee. He was the kind of guy that other people quietly resented because he was always 3 steps ahead. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't walk around bragging. He just saw things, patterns, gaps, opportunities that other people walked past every single day without noticing. And for 3 years, he poured everything he had into Vortex. He skipped vacations. He missed his best friend's wedding. Actually missed it because he was finishing a product demo that his boss needed by Monday morning. He told himself it was all going to be worth it, that the company would see what he was building and reward him for it. He really believed that. The idea he'd been working on was called FlowSync, and at the time, nothing like it existed. Here's the simple version. FlowSync was a software platform that connected internal company workflows with real-time data from external vendors and partners. So instead of a company's operations team having to manually update spreadsheets and chase down suppliers by email, FlowSync automated all of it. It pulled live data, flagged delays, adjusted timelines automatically, and sent alerts before problems even happened. Sounds simple now, right? But in 2017, the tools companies were using for this stuff were clunky, outdated, and required a full IT team just to maintain. Daniel's idea was to make it lightweight, intuitive, and affordable enough for mid-size companies, the ones that were too big to run on gut instinct, but too small to afford enterprise software. He spent 18 months building the prototype, nights, weekends, sometimes 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, because an idea hit him and he couldn't sleep until he got it out of his head. He even paid out of pocket for some of the development tools because the company's budget approval process would have taken 6 months, and he didn't want to wait. He was that committed. Now, his boss at the time was a man named Richard Hale. Richard was in his mid-40s, polished, the kind of guy who gave great presentations and always seemed to be in the right room at the right time. He had a talent for making other people's work sound like his own vision, and most of the time, nobody called him on it because he was the VP of product and he had the ear of the CEO. Daniel knew Richard wasn't the most original thinker in the building, but he didn't think that mattered. He figured as long as the work was good, the right people would eventually notice. That was his first mistake. In January of 2018, Daniel put together a full presentation for FlowSync. Slides, financial projections, a working prototype, 3 potential pilot clients he'd already spoken to informally. He was ready. He walked into Richard's office on a Thursday afternoon, sat down, and walked him through the whole thing. Richard barely spoke during the presentation. He asked a few questions, took some notes. At the end, he leaned back in his chair, looked at Daniel, and said, "And this part matters," he said. "This is interesting. Leave everything with me. I'll take it to the executive team." Daniel felt good walking out of that office. He thought he'd finally done it. He thought this was the moment things were going to change. 3 weeks went by. Nothing. He emailed Richard. Got a 1-line reply. "Still in review." Another 2 weeks. Nothing. Then one morning, Daniel walked into the office and noticed something strange. 2 of the senior engineers, guys he barely interacted with, were huddled together in a conference room with the blinds pulled. He didn't think much of it at first, but then he heard a word through the door that stopped him cold. FlowSync. He stood there in the hallway for a second, not sure if he'd heard right. Then he kept walking, told himself he was being paranoid. He wasn't. 2 weeks after that, the company held an all-hands meeting. Daniel sat in the back row like usual. Richard took the stage and started talking about a new product initiative that Vortex was going to be pursuing. Something that would transform how mid-size companies manage operational workflows. Daniel's stomach dropped. Richard described the product, feature by feature, use case by use case, integration model, target market, pricing structure. It was FlowSync, every single piece of it, renamed, repackaged, and being presented to the entire company as Richard's brainchild. Daniel sat completely still. He felt like the room was closing in on him. People around him were nodding, excited, clapping at the end. Someone leaned over and whispered, "This is huge." And Daniel just sat there, staring at the stage, watching the man who had just stolen 18 months of his life take a bow. He didn't say anything that day. He didn't know what to say. He went home, sat in his apartment, and just stared at the wall for a while. But here's where it gets even worse. The following Monday, Daniel was called into HR. He was told that his role at Vortex was being restructured, which is corporate speak for eliminated. They handed him a 2-week severance package, thanked him for his contributions, and told him to have his desk cleared by end of day. Richard didn't even come down to say anything to him. Not a word. Daniel packed up his stuff, walked to his car, sat down in the driver's seat, and didn't move for almost an hour. He had just lost his job, his income, his creation, his idea that he had poured a year and a half of his life into was now the property of the man who'd taken it from him. And there was nothing he could do about it. Or so he thought. Because here's the thing about Daniel Mercer that Richard Hale severely underestimated. Daniel didn't just understand the product, he was the product. He knew every line of logic behind it, every decision, every version that didn't work, and why. Every iteration that did. Richard had the presentation, the prototype, the name. But Daniel had something Richard could never take. The mind that built it. And sitting in that parking lot, somewhere between devastated and furious, Daniel made a decision that would take 5 years to play out. But when it did, it would completely destroy everything Richard thought he'd won. And before we keep going, If this story is already hitting you, drop a comment right now telling me what you would have done in Daniel's position. Would you have confronted Richard on the spot? Would you have gone straight to the CEO? Or would you have done what Daniel did? Let me know down there. I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it right now, because the way this story ends is something you do not want to miss. All right, let's get back into it. Daniel went home that night and did something that most people in his position wouldn't have done. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't post about it online. He didn't spiral into anger for weeks feeling sorry for himself, even though he had every right to. He opened his laptop and started writing. Not a complaint, not a journal entry, a business plan. Because the moment Richard stole FlowSync, he also made the biggest mistake of his career. He showed Daniel exactly what the market wanted. He validated the idea in front of an entire company. He basically handed Daniel a roadmap and said, without knowing it, this is worth building. So Daniel decided to build it again. Better. And this time for himself. He called it Streamline. Now, Daniel had almost no money at this point. 2 weeks of severance, about $4,000 in savings, and a 1-bedroom apartment in Austin, with rent due in 3 weeks. He wasn't coming from money. He didn't have a rich uncle or a trust fund or a safety net of any kind. What he had was time, skill, and an anger that he decided to turn into fuel instead of poison. The first thing he did was reach out to a former colleague named Priya, a front-end developer he'd worked with at Vortex 2 years earlier, who had left on her own terms. Priya was sharp, fast, and she'd always respected Daniel's work. He called her, told her everything that happened, and asked her if she wanted in. She said yes before he finished the sentence. They started working out of Daniel's apartment. No office, no funding, no team, just 2 laptops, a shared Google Doc, and a whiteboard Daniel had bought at a garage sale for $8. The early days were rough in a way that's hard to fully describe unless you've lived it. Daniel was coding during the day and doing freelance IT work at night just to keep the lights on. He was sleeping maybe 5 hours if he was lucky. There were nights he ate cereal for dinner 3 days in a row because he didn't have time to cook and didn't want to spend money on food delivery. Priya was working a part-time remote job on the side to cover her own bills while building Streamline with Daniel on nights and weekends. They gave themselves 1 year. If they couldn't get at least 1 paying customer in 12 months, they'd walk away. Meanwhile, back at Vortex, Richard was moving fast. The company had started formally developing the product Daniel had designed, the one they were now calling Nexus Flow internally. They hired a small team, allocated budget, started building infrastructure. Richard was presenting quarterly updates to the board. Getting praised. Getting promoted. He was appointed as SVP of Product by June of that year. He was living off Daniel's idea and doing very well with it. But here's what Richard didn't know. He didn't understand the product deeply enough to build it right. He had the surface level, the pitch, the concept, the general direction. But the actual technical architecture that made FlowSync work the way Daniel had designed it, that nuance, Richard had no idea how to replicate it. And the engineers he hired were building it from the outside in, guessing at decisions that Daniel had made deliberately after months of testing. So the version of the product that Vortex was building was clunky. It worked, barely. But it wasn't elegant. It wasn't intuitive. It had workarounds where there should have been solutions, and the more they tried to scale it, the more problems surfaced. Daniel knew this would happen. He knew it because he had gone down every wrong path himself before finding the right one. He knew exactly where the cracks would form, and he was already building the version that didn't have those cracks. By month 7, Daniel and Priya had a working beta of Streamline. It was cleaner than anything Vortex was building, faster, easier to set up. And because Daniel had designed it from scratch the second time with a clear head and real-world feedback in mind, it solved problems the original prototype hadn't even addressed yet. They got their first pilot client through a connection Priya had, a small logistics company in Dallas with about 80 employees. The operations manager there had been complaining for months about how disorganized their vendor communication was. Priya got them on a call with Daniel. Daniel did a live demo, and by the end of the call, the guy said, quote, "When can we start?" They charged them $400 a month. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was proof. That one client became a case study. Daniel documented everything: the problem the company had, how Streamline fixed it, the time they saved, the errors that stopped happening. He turned it into a 2-page document and started sending it to other companies in the same space. Within 3 months, they had 6 paying clients, then 12. Then a small article in a regional tech blog picked up on Streamline and described it as the lean alternative to overbuilt enterprise workflow tools. It wasn't a big publication, but the right people read it. One of those people was a venture capital partner named Sandra Cole, based in San Francisco. She had been watching the workflow automation space for a while and had already passed on 2 other companies in the sector that she felt were overcomplicating the product. When she read about Streamline, she reached out to Daniel directly through LinkedIn. Her message was 4 sentences long. The last one was, "Are you raising?" Daniel stared at that message for probably 10 minutes before he responded. He wrote back the same day. They got on a call that Friday. Sandra was direct. She asked hard questions. She wanted to know the technical architecture, the churn rate, the expansion strategy, why this was better than what was already out there, and why Daniel specifically was the right person to build it. That last question, Daniel answered it in a way that surprised even himself. He said, "Because I've already built this once. Someone else took it. And everything I learned from that, every mistake, every shortcut I refused to take, every decision I made the hard way, is baked into what you're looking at right now. You're not funding a first attempt. You're funding the corrected version." Sandra was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Send me the data room." 6 weeks later, Streamline closed a $1.2 million seed round. Sandra's firm led it. Daniel paid off his credit card debt the same day the money hit the account. Then he called Priya and told her she was officially full-time. She cried. He didn't tell her that he did too after he hung up. With real funding behind them, things started moving at a different speed. They hired 3 engineers, moved into a small shared office space, started running actual sales outreach instead of just referrals, built out the product roadmap that Daniel had sketched on that garage sale whiteboard 18 months earlier. By the end of year 2, Streamline had over 200 business clients, and was generating just under $3 million in annual recurring revenue. And Vortex, the company that had stolen Daniel's idea, fired him and bet everything on a product they didn't fully understand, was starting to quietly struggle. Nexus Flow, their version of Daniel's original concept, had launched publicly to lukewarm reviews. Clients complained about the setup process being too complicated. The support tickets were piling up. 2 of the anchor clients they'd signed in the early days had already churned off the platform. The board was asking hard questions. Richard, for the first time, didn't have clean answers. And somewhere across Austin, in a real office now with a real team, Daniel was watching all of this happen in real time. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with a quiet, steady sense of clarity. He wasn't chasing revenge. He was building something real. But he also wasn't going to look away from what was coming. Because by year 3, Vortex wasn't just struggling with one product. The whole company was starting to crack. And Daniel, without fully planning it, was about to be in a position that nobody, not even him, had seen coming. Okay, real quick before we get to the ending. And trust me, the ending is the part you've been waiting for. Drop a comment right now with just one word that describes how you'd feel walking back into that office. One word. I want to see what you guys say. And if you've been watching this whole thing and you're still not subscribed, what are you doing? Hit that button right now, because we drop stories like this every single week, and you don't want to miss the next one. Okay, let's finish this. By the start of year 3, Daniel wasn't thinking about Vortex every day anymore. That's actually important. Because in the beginning, if he was being honest, some of what drove him was anger. The image of Richard standing on that stage. The HR lady handing him a manila envelope. The drive home with his box of stuff in the back seat. That stuff lived in him for a while. But somewhere around the 18-month mark of building Streamline, something shifted. He stopped thinking about what Richard had taken and started thinking about what he was building. The anger burned off, and what was left underneath it was just pure focus. He had a real company now, real people depending on him, real clients whose businesses ran better because of software he had designed. That meant more to him than any revenge fantasy ever could. So when the news started coming out about Vortex, the layoffs, the missed targets, the board reshuffling, Daniel didn't celebrate. He just watched. And he kept building. Streamline crossed $5 million in annual recurring revenue midway through year 3. They expanded the team to 22 people, moved into a proper office, started getting inbound interest from enterprise clients, the kind of companies that Daniel had originally imagined using FlowSync back when he was sketching it out on napkins in his apartment at 2 a.m. Sandra's firm was happy. There were early conversations about a Series A. And then one afternoon, Daniel got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't pick up. It was a partner at a private equity firm called Halcyon Group. His name was Marcus Webb. He was calm, professional, very measured the way people in that world tend to be. He told Daniel that Halcyon had been tracking the workflow automation space for about 18 months, that they'd looked at several companies, that Streamline kept coming up as the most technically sound product in the mid-market segment. And then he said something that made Daniel go very still. He said Halcyon had also recently acquired a controlling interest in Vortex Systems. Daniel didn't say anything for a second. Just let that land. Marcus kept going. He said Vortex had strong enterprise relationships and decent infrastructure, but their core product, Nexus Flow, was underperforming, and the technical team had been unable to fix the underlying architecture issues. Halcyon wanted to turn the company around. They believed the right move was to bring in outside leadership, someone who understood the space deeply, someone who could rebuild the product from the ground up and restore client confidence. And then Marcus said, "We'd like to talk to you about taking the CEO role." Daniel was quiet for so long that Marcus asked if he was still on the line. He was. He was just sitting there in his office chair, staring at the wall, doing the math on what he was being told. The company that had stolen his idea. That had fired him with 2 weeks severance and a box of his belongings. That had handed his creation to the man who betrayed him and let that man ride it all the way to a senior vice president title. That company was now asking him to come in and run it. He told Marcus he needed a few days to think about it. He called Priya first, told her everything. She didn't say anything for a moment, and then she just started laughing. Not in a mean way, just the kind of laugh that comes out when something is so wild that words don't cover it. Then she said, "You have to do it. You know you have to do it." He called Sandra next. She told him to make sure the terms protected Streamline, and that if the deal was structured right, this could actually accelerate everything. The client base, the infrastructure, the path to a much larger exit. He spent 2 days going through the numbers on Vortex. Their financials were a mess, but the bones were there. The enterprise-client relationships were real. The infrastructure, like Marcus had said, was solid. The problem was purely the product, which was, of course, the thing Daniel knew better than anyone alive. He called Marcus back on a Thursday morning. He said yes. The paperwork took 6 weeks. There were lawyers and term sheets and long calls that went past midnight. But eventually, it was done. Daniel Mercer, age 33, was named Chief Executive Officer of Vortex Systems. His first day in the building was a Monday in early spring. He wore the same kind of clothes he always wore: dark jeans, a plain shirt, sneakers. He didn't make a big entrance. He didn't send a dramatic company-wide email the night before. He just walked in through the front door, took the elevator up, and went to what was now his office. And yes, it was Richard's old office. Richard had been let go by Halcyon 3 months before Daniel came on board. He was gone before Daniel ever set foot in the building, so there was no dramatic confrontation. No moment where Daniel sat down across from Richard and let the silence do the talking. Some people hear that part and feel a little disappointed, like they wanted that scene. But Daniel said something about that later in an interview. He said the moment he walked into that office wasn't about Richard at all. It wasn't about settling a score or proving a point to someone who had wronged him. He said when he walked in and sat down at that desk, what he felt wasn't triumph over another person. He said what he felt was peace, because the thing Richard had taken from him, the idea, the credit, the moment that should have been his, none of that mattered anymore. Not because it hadn't hurt. It had. It had hurt badly and for a long time. But because everything that came after it had built something so much bigger than what was taken, that the original loss almost looked small by comparison. Richard took FlowSync and got a title and a few good quarters out of it before it collapsed under him. Daniel lost FlowSync and built a company worth over $10 million. Closed a Series A 8 months after taking the CEO role at Vortex. Rebuilt a Nexus Flow from the ground up, using the architecture he'd always known was right. And within 2 years had turned Vortex from a struggling mid-sized tech company into one of the fastest-growing workflow platforms in the country. He brought Priya over as CTO. Sandra joined the board, and the 20 or so employees who had still been at Vortex when Daniel came in, the ones who had nothing to do with what Richard had done, the ones who were just people trying to do good work. Daniel invested in every single one of them. Raised salaries, rebuilt culture, created an internal equity program so that the people building the product would actually own a piece of what they were building, because he remembered what it felt like to build something and have someone else walk away with it. He wasn't going to be the reason somebody else felt that way. That part of the story doesn't make the headlines as much. The revenge angle is what people click on. But Daniel said that was the part he was most proud of. Not the valuation, not the title, the fact that he had the chance to build something right, the way he always believed it should be built. And he actually did it. There's a quote he gave in a podcast interview about 2 years after all of this happened. He was asked what he would say to the version of himself sitting in that parking lot after getting fired. And he said, "I'm going to read this exactly because it's worth getting right." He said, "I'd tell him the worst day of his life just became the most important one. Not because it gets better automatically, but because now he has no choice but to build something that's actually his." Look, most of us aren't going to have our ideas stolen by a boss and end up buying the company 5 years later. That's a rare story, but the thing inside that story, the part about losing something you worked hard for, feeling like the ground got pulled out from under you, and having to decide what you do next, that part is not rare at all. That part is just life. And what Daniel's story really says isn't work hard and you'll get revenge. It says something quieter than that. It says the people who come back from the worst moments aren't the ones who had the most resources or the best luck or the clearest path forward. They're the ones who decided in a parking lot or a kitchen or a bedroom at 2 a.m. that what happened to them wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the real one. If this story hit you the way it hit me, putting it together, subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming, and you don't want to miss them.